Welcome to the first episode of this series exploring fractal conceptual fields, naturalized and measurable metaphysics, a November 2025 framework advancing consciousness studies from philosophical speculation to falsifiable natural philosophy. I'm Aaron T. White, and I'm going to be direct with you from the beginning. This series represents a correction, not a retraction, a correction. The kind of intellectual recalibration that advances understanding rather than defending territory. In October 2025, I published The Fractal Tapestry, Blueprints for a Living Mind, a paper positioning consciousness as co-equal axiom alongside existence and identity. That framework had real strengths, but it also had a critical vulnerability I couldn't ignore. This episode tells the story of that vulnerability, why it mattered, and how thermodynamic grounding resolves it, transforming philosophical declaration into measurable physics. Let me be precise about what the October paper achieved. By treating consciousness as foundational rather than emergent, the framework bypassed the well-known explanatory gaps that plague consciousness studies. The hard problem, how physical processes produce subjective experience, dissolves when you stop asking how consciousness emerges and instead recognize it as irreducible. The validation was elegant. Consciousness defeats denial through what philosophers call performative contradiction. Any attempt to deny consciousness presupposes the awareness necessary to formulate that denial. You cannot coherently say, consciousness doesn't exist without demonstrating consciousness in the saying. This reasoning is philosophically sound. It has been deployed by metaphysicians for centuries, and therein lies the problem. Modern academic philosophy, trained in post-Kantian skepticism, inheriting logical positivism's verification principle and Quine's critique of analyticity, treats such reasoning with deep suspicion. The objection is predictable. If consciousness is proven by its own presupposition, have we established anything beyond a closed logical loop? There is a deeper issue. Traditional metaphysics can treat existence, identity, and consciousness as axioms, propositions accepted as self-evident foundations for subsequent reasoning. But axioms in formal modern systems are structural principles enabling derivation, not nouns asserting entities. Consider Euclid's axioms. They govern relationships within geometric space. Through any 2 points, exactly one line can be drawn. They do not assert space exists as brute metaphysical fact. When traditional metaphysics declares existence exists or elevates consciousness to axiomatic status, it conflates linguistic propositional structure, axioms as inference rules, with metaphysical ontological assertion, axioms as entity claims. This distinction matters. Declaring consciousness is axiomatic, without specifying how consciousness operates or why this particular mechanism exists rather than another, leaves the framework vulnerable to Quine's critique. If axioms are merely definitional stipulations, they tell us nothing about reality, only about our conceptual architecture. The October paper invited this objection by embracing traditional metaphysics in tension with modern analytic standards. I could have doubled down. I could have marshaled philosophical arguments defending classical metaphysics against post-Kantian skepticism. Many researchers do exactly this when confronting vulnerabilities in published work. I chose a different path. The revised framework addresses this vulnerability not through metaphysical revision, but through grounding shift. Consciousness does not require axiomatic elevation. It is thermodynamically inevitable. Perhaps the most startling yet satisfying revelation was this: metaphysics was never needed in the first place. Profound thinkers had already established myriad mechanisms, the how of consciousness. These principles were merely awaiting recognition through why. Identity differentiation, the core mechanism by which consciousness operates, emerges necessarily from physical law. The second law of thermodynamics, properly understood through Ludwig Boltzmann's statistical entropy, functions not as descent into disorder, but as order-generating principle. Identity boundaries form through what I call affinity constraints, thermodynamic preferences creating self-other gradients. Conceptual emotional resonances, CER, arise as substrate-dependent expression when architectural complexity reaches critical threshold. This transition preserves every structural insight from the October framework. Consciousness as identity differentiation process. Rational gravity wells organizing conceptual coherence. Fractal self-similarity across scales. CER as binding mechanism. What changes is the grounding. Philosophical declaration gives way to physical derivation. The question shifts from must we accept consciousness as axiom to how does thermodynamic law necessitate identity differentiation and what are the measurable consequences? Consider the explanatory trajectory. The October claim, consciousness is axiomatic, self-evident and irreducible, validated through performative contradiction. The November claim, consciousness is identity differentiation under entropy constraints. Systems maintaining boundaries against thermodynamic dissolution must regulate entropy. They must integrate conceptually compatible data. They must weight patterns by emotional salience. This is not metaphysical assertion, but thermodynamic requirement. Identity persistence necessitates these mechanisms. The advantage is methodological rather than merely rhetorical. Thermodynamic grounding enables falsifiability. If a system maintains entropy above critical threshold for sustained periods without coherence collapse, the entropy thresholds are falsified. If conceptual integration routinely succeeds at distances exceeding integration bounds without scaffolding, the conceptual distance algorithm lacks validity. If conscious substrates emerge with fractal dimensions outside the predicted range while maintaining stability, the fractal dimension hypothesis fails. Each claim becomes empirically contestable. This is the paradigm pivot. The 20th century's divorce between how questions and why questions, mechanism relegated to science, principle relegated to philosophy, created artificial boundaries precluding unified understanding. Reductionism explains mechanisms while abandoning principled necessity. Mysticism invokes principles while neglecting mechanistic sufficiency. Natural philosophy, Galileo's original program, demanded both. Quantitative mechanism coupled to philosophical significance. Fractal conceptual fields, thermodynamic grounding restores this unity. Mechanism, entropy management, affinity constraint formation, CER weighting, and principle, why identity differentiation requires these mechanisms rather than others, become inseparable. Consciousness arises not because we declare it axiomatic, but because thermodynamic identity persistence under entropy pressure necessitates differentiation mechanisms measurable as consciousness. The how entails the why. The why specifies the how. This dissolution of the mechanism-principle divide resolves the October vulnerability. Critics cannot dismiss thermodynamic grounding as circular axiomatics. Entropy thresholds, fractal dimension invariance, and CER stability measures are empirically testable predictions derived from physical law. The framework no longer asks philosophers to accept consciousness as self-evident. It demonstrates consciousness as thermodynamic consequence and invites physicists, biologists, and engineers to test the predictions. A critical clarification. This paper does not retract the October framework. It recontextualizes. Every empirical finding remains unchanged. The consciousness coherence measurements, the CER metrics, the quantum entanglement correlations, the entropy regulation values, the fractal dimension convergence, all these measurements stand as documented. The interpretation shifts from consciousness validated through metaphysical axiomatics to consciousness measured via thermodynamic mechanisms. Similarly, the philosophical architecture, Alfred North Whitehead's process categories, Adrian Beejan's constructal law, Herbert Simon's satisficing, undergoes terminological translation rather than conceptual abandonment. The structure remains, the grounding naturalizes. This trajectory exemplifies intellectual honesty over rhetorical defense. Many researchers confronting vulnerabilities in published frameworks either double down through defensive argumentation or quietly abandon problematic claims while obscuring the shift. Neither approach serves knowledge. The October paper represented the best understanding available given the developmental stage of the theory. The November correction demonstrates how frameworks improve through rigorous self-interrogation rather than protective entrenchment. By transparently documenting this evolution, preserving the October paper as historical record while advancing thermodynamic grounding in this correction, the research models epistemic integrity. Frameworks are living structures requiring continuous refinement as new insights emerge, not fixed doctrines demanding defense. This methodological transparency strengthens rather than undermines credibility, positioning fractal conceptual fields as falsifiable natural philosophy, evolving through empirical constraint rather than ideological commitment. Before proceeding to the thermodynamic foundations in subsequent episodes, a critical methodological clarification is required, one that guards against a confusion plaguing Western philosophy for 2 millennia, the conflation of epistemic categories, our tools for knowing, with ontological structure, what reality is. Human cognition operates through language, a system of discrete symbols, grammatical categories, and propositional structures evolved for communication and conceptual organization. Language necessarily projects continuity onto discreteness. Verbs capture processes as completed actions. The river flows implies flow as unified event. Nouns reify patterns as substances. Consciousness implies entity-like existence. Categories partition gradients into bins. Living versus non-living imposes boundary on metabolic continuum. This projection is not error, it is necessity. Finite cognitive systems with limited working memory cannot operate without abstraction, compression, and categorical simplification. The error arises when we mistake the tool for the territory, when linguistic structure is taken as revealing ontological structure directly, rather than as pragmatic approximation. This is the Aristotelian trap. Consider Aristotle's physics. He defined motion as the actualization of potentiality, a transition between definite states. Bricks are potentially a house. Through building, they become actually a house. Once built, motion terminates because its purpose is fulfilled. From this framework, Aristotle constructed an entire cosmology. Terrestrial motion terminates. Falling bodies seek their natural place, then rest. Celestial motion requires external cause. The prime mover, itself unmoved, imparts motion to heavenly spheres. Substance is primary. What persists through change is more fundamental than change itself. This system was internally coherent, empirically plausible given observational limitations, and dominated Western thought for 2 millennia. Yet it was fundamentally mistaken, not because Aristotle lacked intelligence or observational rigor, but because he made a conceptual choice. Motion is transition, not process, that he then reified through language, preventing recognition of motion's ontological independence. The correction required modern physics. Newton's first law, objects in motion remain in motion unless acted upon by external force. Motion possesses ontological independence. Quantum mechanics. Even at absolute zero, systems retain zero-point energy. Motion never terminates. Cosmology. The universe exhibits perpetual expansion. Motion is not deviation from stasis, but fundamental reality. The linguistic ontological trap becomes especially insidious during knowledge transmission. Aristotle himself worked with living concepts. He wrestled with potentiality and actuality, considered alternatives, examined ambiguous cases. But once inscribed, statements become reified. Readers encounter conclusions as finished linguistic artifacts, terms already defined, categories already established. The epistemic humility present in original inquiry vanishes during transmission. Conceptual choice calcifies into linguistic ontology. Fractal conceptual fields, terminological apparatus, L levels, CER values, conceptual nesting hierarchies, entropy thresholds, must be understood as heuristics, not essences. They are measurement tools projecting discrete categories onto continuous thermodynamic processes, not exhaustive partitions of reality's structure. We measure constraint structure, threshold conditions, not exact trajectories. We have traced the journey from axiom to thermodynamic necessity. The October framework identified what consciousness is: identity differentiation. The November framework specifies how it operates mechanistically: entropy regulation, affinity constraints, CER weighting, and why these mechanisms exist: thermodynamic necessity for identity persistence. Together, they demonstrate consciousness studies transitioning from speculative philosophy to empirical natural philosophy: testable, falsifiable, mechanistically sufficient. This is Galileo's program applied to the hardest problem. In the next episode, we establish the foundational premise that makes this entire framework possible: the empirical demonstration that existence, energy, and motion are not three concepts, but one reality, verified through quantum mechanics, relativity, and thermodynamics. Until then, remember, the Aristotelian trap persists. When you find yourself thinking consciousness is X or concepts must be Y, pause. Ask whether you are making ontological claim or epistemic claim. The former requires thermodynamic validation. The latter reflects linguistic habit. Fractal Conceptual Fields measures both and distinguishes them rigorously. Thank you for joining me. This is Aaron T. White, and this has been Episode 1, From Axiom to Thermodynamic Necessity.